Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. This is the second Tokyo Global Dialogue. And this is breakout part 2, and we'll be focusing in this breakout session on Russia. I'm looking forward to having this discussion with all of you. I will be serving as the moderator. I am SHIMOTOMAI from Kanagawa University. Well, February, 75 years ago, George Kennan sent a long telegram from the Russian embassy. This was a transition from World War II to the Cold War. And some 40-plus years have passed, and after the Cold War, and also what we're seeing, what is happening around the world, I think we are again facing a similar transition, a transformation in the world. Now, today, the theme is, such a transformation is a time when we hear new names. This region, which was called Asia-Pacific, it is now being referred to as Indo-Pacific. A new term is being used. And this is having implications on the international politics. It's a reality that we face right now. International politics, international economics is trying to interpret what this transformation means. And Indo-Pacific, this keyword Indo-Pacific, how effective is it? It is a new name, and there is a person who gives the name. Thinking of who came up with this is Yudhoyono, President of Indonesia, or some people say President Obama, or Japanese Prime Minister Abe, the former immediate past Prime Minister. So these are the names that come up. But still, I think from the Russian view, I think Russia is one of the important players in international politics. And Bailing from the 17th century, the Bering Sea discoverer. It was said that the new continent was Indian, and so the people there were called Indians. But no. Ever since Bering, through the Pacific to India, we have this new perspective. The new perspective was born. So, from the Arctic to the Bering Sea, this Bering was not a Russian. It was a Danish person. So the Indo-Pacific transformation. How does Russia see Indo-Pacific? I think it's very important that we hear about the Russian view of Indo-Pacific, and that is the reason why this session is being held today. So what we'll be discussing in this session, I'll ask the speakers to talk on several points. I've already informed them of what we want to cover, but Putin's Asian policy, pivot to the East. I think that this has major implications on our view of even history. And therefore, we want to look at what's happening in Asia and look at this keyword, Indo-Pacific, at this panel discussion. The speakers, while they're speaking, using the QA function, the viewers, we kindly ask you to send us your questions. So in this panel discussion, at the outset, well, I'm maybe respecting the seniority system. This is a Japanese culture to respect the seniority system. So I would like to ask Dr. Dmitri TRENIN to talk about the birth of the Biden administration and the New START treaty has been extended. And in Asia, India, and China are rising. And also there are topics regarding Japan-Russia relations. Well, Dr. TRENIN can cover all these topics. It's up to you to decide what you want to speak. And I would like to give the floor to Dr. TRENIN, please.
Well, thank you very much, Chairman. It's an honor, it's a privilege to be invited to the Tokyo Global Dialogue Forum. And I'm glad to be on such an illustrious panel. Thank you very much for having me. Chairman, you asked many questions. We were also issued some guiding questions by the organizers. So I will use my 7 minutes to briefly discuss some of the key issues, such as Russia's pivot to the east, the term Indo-Pacific as it is understood in Russia. I will talk briefly about about the meaning of the changes in the U.S. administration, or rather the change of administration itself in the United States, as far as relations with Russia and relations in the, call it Indo-Pacific, call it Asia-Pacific region. And I think that will be all for starters. So my opening point will be that Russia has not so much pivoted to the east as pivoted to itself. Its post-Cold War attempt to integrate into the Euro-Atlantic community ended in failure. As a result, today, Russia stands as a lone great power. The guiding idea of its foreign policy is to have a stable equilibrium in foreign relations, east, west, north, and south. To the extent one can talk about the pivot to the east, this is a move to correct the historical Russian orientation to the west and to have more options benefiting from the rise of Asia. In terms of domestic geopolitics, this is an effort to develop the Siberian and Far Eastern regions of Russia itself. This is an ongoing process. So far, it has been only partially successful. Of course, the breakdown of Russia's relations with Europe and the United States after the Ukraine crisis of 2014 has increased Russia's reliance on China, particularly in terms of trade, technology, as well as finance and investment. In geopolitical and security terms, Russia-Chinese relations have reached a level that I call entente, somewhere between strategic partnership and an alliance. However, let me stress that orientation toward the east that means to correct overwhelming historical orientation of Russia toward Europe, toward the West, is a natural phenomenon that basically is aimed at increasing Russia's international options. With regard to the term Indo-Pacific, geopolitical terms have their uses. For Indonesia, that you mentioned, Chairman, which is an island nation washed by both oceans, Indo-Pacific comes naturally. Japan, of course, is an island nation, a maritime power that naturally puts emphasis on maritime geopolitical terms. India, of course, again, is a country with a huge coastline, and it sits at the top of the Indian Ocean. And the former term Asia-Pacific, in many ways, excluded India. So for India, this is an expansion of a term that did not really satisfy India fully. Russia, as a continental power, views the term Indo-Pacific when it's used by the United States as an instrument of U.S. policy to contain China. As a continental power, Russia uses instead the concept of Greater Eurasia, which means Europe plus Asia and the seas and islands around them, because that's where Russia sits. It sits in the north of that huge macro continent. Russia sees the rise of non-Western powers, particularly China and India, as part of the fundamental change in the global order, away from traditional Western dominance. To Moscow, both Beijing and Delhi are close partners, and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization is a platform for security management and security building in Eurasia. Russia is very concerned about the rise of Sino-India tensions leading to conflicts. And finally, the change of administration in the United States does not mean a change in the U.S. policy toward China, which remains confrontational and aimed at containing China and defending U.S. primacy and dominance. I think this has been amply made, this point has been made in all clarity by President Biden in his recent speeches. The U.S. policy of dual containment of both China and Russia inevitably leads to progressively closer and stronger ties between Moscow and Beijing. U.S. attempts to wean off Russia from China are unlikely to be serious, and if they are made, they are unlikely to be successful. And let me end on this remark. Rather than driving wedges between Moscow and Beijing, a smart U.S. policy would be to encourage a rapprochement between Moscow and Tokyo, because this would help Russia diversify its Asia-Pacific strategy and lead to a better geopolitical balance among China, Japan, and Russia. However, the anti-Russia animus in the United States appears insurmountable in the foreseeable future. It seems more important for Washington to apply maximum pressure on Moscow, hoping that the Kremlin will crack at some point, most probably in the course of the forthcoming leadership change, whenever it comes. Let me stop here, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. TRENIN. And now we'd like to ask from Japan, Professor Hirose from Keio University to address the same issues. Professor Hirose is versed in Russian issues, and she was doing research first in Azerbaijan, and recently she is researching in Nordic and other areas. And so from your perspective, I would like you to talk about how you see this Indo-Pacific issue. I'll give you 7 minutes. Thank you very much, Professor SHIMOTOMAI. I am Hirose from Keio University. First of all, I'd like to thank you very much for inviting me to this outstanding, prestigious gathering. I'd like to, one by one, try to respond to the questions given to me. First, about Russia's pivot to the east. Russia's pivot to the east, unlike the U.S. pivot to Asia, is focused on not just strengthening its foreign relations in Asia-Pacific, but also to develop its Far East. It is also a domestic issue focused on the eastern half of Russia. As we saw with the 2012 Vladivostok APEC meeting success, Russia is focused on developing the area. In 2018, I had an opportunity to visit Kunashiri, Shikotan Islands in a visa-free visit, and I was amazed to see the development taking place. On the diplomatic front, Russia is not only building relations with China, but India, Vietnam, South Korea, amongst others. Such a multifaceted relationship is keeping an eye on having a power balance with the rising power of China. But Japan should be included in the East, but regrettably, we're not seeing any progress in bilateral relations. And next, about the change, the strategic change in the Indo-Pacific region and the SCO. First, the U.S. Indo-Pacific policy, and in case of Japan, we call it FOIP. But Russia sees this as a means to contain Russia and China. And therefore, Russia attaches importance to its relations with not only China, but India. India is an important partner even during the days of the Soviet Union. And recently, its relations with India is becoming more important. By maintaining good relations with India, Russia will improve its position in Asia, but also establish a good power balance versus China. And also, having good relations with India and China will be a powerful counterbalance to the West Indo-Pacific policy. SCO has been driven by Russia and China, and some say it's a symbol of Russia-China's honeymoon. Meanwhile, it is a platform for Russia and China's power struggle. For example, it is true that India joined SCO supported by Russia, and meanwhile, India's rival Pakistan joined SCO with the support from China. At the SCO, there is a power struggle behind the scenes, and it is unlikely that they will unite in the face of Western threat. Now, third, about the impact of the U.S. administration change. President Biden is pledging to take a strong stance against China and Russia, and attention will rise in the Indo-Pacific. But Biden is saying the U.S. will cooperate and hold dialogues with China where possible. So compared to its relations with Russia, U.S. seems to be more flexible with China. But the extension of the New START treaty is a good step towards improving relations and putting a stop to the endless arms race. But China is developing, and the nuclear disarmament negotiation with China seems to be unlikely in the future. Now, about the Biden's Indo-Pacific policy, as long as Japan tries to maintain the U.S.-Japan alliance, if there were to be some problems, Biden takes a strong hardline position against Russia, it is inevitable that Japan-Russia relations will be impacted. And Russia is worried that U.S. bases will be established in the northern islands if they return to Japan. So Russia will try to, if something happens, put pressure on Japan through U.S.-Japan alliance and U.S. military bases. And Japan will be faced with a dilemma trying to maintain its alliance with the U.S. but at the same time improving relations with Russia. Lastly, about the energy issue. Prime Minister Suga has pledged to achieve carbon neutrality in 2050. But there are a number of issues that will have to be dealt with in order to achieve this goal. One country alone cannot achieve this goal. Meanwhile, Russia in 2020 March released its long-term strategy for green a GHG reduction towards 2050. They came up with 4 scenarios. But even with the most ambitious scenario, it is unlikely and impossible for carbon neutrality to be achieved at the end of the century. Meanwhile, Russia is focused on the use of hydrogen. Through cooperation with Japan, it could become a win-win project for both countries. In carbon neutrality, we think that such efforts will be not only mutually beneficial but globally beneficial. It is extremely realistic, and strengthening cooperation in this area will help to improve the relations between Japan and Russia. With this, I would like to conclude. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so very much, Professor Hirose. Now then, we would like to move on to the next speaker as moderator. Let me call upon Professor Anna KIREEVA to talk about how Moscow currently views Russia's pivot to the east. And of course, she has posed many other issues in her synopsis, but because you're so well versed in the Indo-Pacific, if you could share with us your views on Russia. Thank you.
It's a great honor for me to be here, and really many thanks for inviting in this distinguished panel. Could you please turn on the presentation, the PPT? Yeah, thank you. My PPT will actually echo a lot of what the distinguished Dmitri TRENIN has already said, so I probably will focus on the things that would develop along the same views. Next slide, please. So we have already mentioned today what have been the reasons behind Russia trying to develop relations with Asia in a greater way. And of course, if we look at what has really been very evidently achieved in the last several years, the first thing that we, of course, can't but notice is that Russia has been significantly enhancing its level of cooperation with China, and especially in security issues, as kind of an answer to the pressure that from the United States on both. We have seen expanded arms sales, also expansion of geography of military exercises, and China's greater participation in the exercises, including Russia's strategic exercises. Also, there was an announcement by Putin that Russia has been helping China to construct missile early warning system, which basically means that cooperation has been moving into the strategic domain, previously not used before. Also, we have seen large-scale energy deals in natural gas and LNG in the Arctic. And apart from that, we have seen some diversification of investment. And specifically, we could talk about automobile manufacturing, agriculture, IT sphere, electronic commerce, and other spheres. One of the statements by President Putin at Waldai late last year was that the relationship has been characterized by such level of interaction and trust that military alliance is not needed, but we could theoretically conceive this possibility, which could probably mean a kind of a signal to the United States, just to see that the United States has been pushing Russia more and more into military cooperation with China. Next slide, please. But if we try to analyze, we do have points of convergence and also divergence of Russia-China interests in Asia. In terms of common interests, we can say that both Russia and China pose American alliance system and what is called dominance in Asia. Also, they pose a ballistic missile defense system and especially possible intermediate range missile deployment by the United States. Also, the positions do converge on the Korean Peninsula because they have Russia and China share a lot in common here. However, there are a lot of challenges that arise from enhanced cooperation with China to Russia's policy in Asia, to Russia's pivot in Asia. So the greatest challenge has been how to keep the balance between China and other states. And even with some diversification of investment, we still face imbalanced trade structure, still lack of this investment diversification, lack of high-tech cooperation, and really no large infrastructure projects. And if the current current trend continues in the long term, where Russia enhances its relations mostly with China, asymmetrical economic and even technological dependence may emerge in the long term. And I should also say that, of course, Russia and China are very famous for sharing the quest for multipolarity in the global system, in the world system globally. However, in Asia, Russia's and China's interests do not fully coincide. And Russia is mostly interested in a polycentric regional order, not a dominance by the US or China. Also, it's still unclear what practical forms of connecting the Belt and Road Initiative and the Eurasian Economic Union and Greater Eurasian Partnership are. And Russia still has been striving more or less to maintain its relations with other Asian states, has been supporting ASEAN centrality. However, if we try to judge what progress we have seen in the last years, we can clearly see that the success in developing relations with China has been much more evident than with other Asian states. Next slide, please. There are areas of divergence of interests between Russia and China in Asia, especially with Russia wanting to promote a polycentric regional order. Russia has been trying to have a neutral position in territorial disputes in both East China Sea and South China Sea. And I should say that Russia's partnerships with countries such as Japan and South Korea for Russia have their own intrinsic value, and both are very important for deep technological modernization of the Far East in the ways more important than China is. Also, for Russia, Vietnam and India have been very important strategic partners, and these are the relations Russia would not like to sacrifice for China. And Russia would really prefer not to be entangled in China's conflicts in East Asia and to try to avoid the entrapment dilemma, for example, in the South China Sea. And generally, Russia would like to maintain as much strategic autonomy as possible against the background of growing China-US competition. So generally, I would say that there is a limit to Russia-China approachment, specifically in Asia, in this region, and Russia has no real interest to become a subordinate player. However, we can see the current trend continues, great military cooperation and actually is more likely, and the possibility of joint actions has been on the increase, and we can see joint air patrols in the Asia-Pacific as an example of these trends. However, full-fledged military alliance with defense pact is quite an unlikely development, at least in the short term and medium term, unless the security threat from the United States become really imminent and unless there is some kind of total economic decoupling and full-fledged financial sanctions that will push both sides into this direction. Next slide, please. However, if we also try to judge the pivot in itself, we'll see that there are a lot of challenges arising for Russia to try to maintain the balance between different states, China and other states, from the challenge from the US pressure, secondary sanctions, and a lot of opposition from the United States and regional institutions. It creates new issues in Russia's relations with Japan, and generally there has been a lot of criticism recently of US-Japan alliance and what it could mean for Russia. In terms of Russia-South Korea relations, Russia has been much more aligned with South Korea's progressive government, as it is also keen on stabilizing the situation on the Korean Peninsula through negotiations. India probably is the second key strategic partner for Russia in Asia with very high level of trust. However, there has recently been more and more pressure of enhanced US-India cooperation. But generally, Russia tries to be kind of an intermediary between China and India. We have seen a very good development in terms of Russia-Japan cooperation. First, they have anti-piracy exercises in the Arabian Sea, which could mean some more level of broad regional cooperation. We have also seen a narrow of new projects and some diversification of economic relations in Russia-Japan relations specifically, and some modest progress, I should say, in economic relations with other states, South Korea, ASEAN, India, some modest progress in attracting foreign direct investment to the Far East. Next slide, please. In terms of India, India is generally seen in Russia as a growing market, and the one with one of the greatest potential. And we have seen recently some new investment projects, and also there is in the maritime Vladivostok-Chennai trade route, fostered by both Modi and Putin at the Eastern Economic Forum, which really looks promising here. There is potential also untapped for trilateral Russia-Japan-India economic cooperation, both in the Far East, in India, and regionally. Also, there has been a project of North-South corridor via Central Asia and Iran, which also has not really been realized up to date, but both Russia and India were interested in this. And one of the latest developments has been that Russia took a decision to establish a military logistic base in Sudan, which actually means potentially increased presence, Russia's increased presence in the Indian Ocean region, which has been very welcomed by India. Next slide, please. Also, in terms of Russia's own integration agenda, Great Eurasian Partnership has seen some new agreements, mostly free trade agreements, and among regional states, it has already concluded agreements with Vietnam and Singapore, and also a lot of negotiations is underway with countries such as India, Indonesia, Thailand, and South Korea. Not all of them will be in trade. South Korea will probably be in investment. However, Russia has been moving, and Eurasian Economic Union has been moving to try to foster some free trade agreements and move into this direction, rather regionally and trans-regionally. Next slide, please. As already mentioned by distinguished Dmitri TRENIN, Russia strongly criticizes the Indo-Pacific, and there are many reasons for that. As you can see on the slide, it is anti-Chinese in nature, and for Russia, it's impossible to join any actions against China. Also, there are problems with rules, with creating a competitive strategic space, undermining ASEAN-centric institutions. Russia supports ASEAN centrality, and also Quad has really been criticized as a future or a possible Asian alliance structure, and there is a risk of downgrading Russia to a marginal player because of this in the Pacific. Also, different steps by the US, such as possible deployment of intermediate-range missiles, present a threat to Russia in the Far East. So some joint actions might take place, and Russia's own actions might take place. However, I should say that Russia's Ministry of Foreign Affairs does not really distinguish a lot between the American versions and other versions, just criticizing them all the way. However, if we look at President Putin's speech at Valdai in 2019, we will see that he has not really been that much critical as Foreign Minister Lavrov has been, and said that Russia would support creating a network of institutions and that will ensure cooperation in Asia based on ASEAN centrality, multilateral economic partnerships, whatever they may be called. Next slide, please. So what are the prospects? Just my kind of a conclusion for this. I would agree that Biden administration will continue to pursue free and open Indo-Pacific with the revision of some measures. What could it mean for Russia-Japan relations? On the one hand, Japan is going to face more pressure in terms of alliance solidarity and compliance to the American policy. On the other hand, Biden promised to listen more to allies, and here Japan could play a very positive role as a kind of intermediary. Probably we are going to have both of them, maybe more on the first alliance solidarity side. However, we can see a trend towards enhancing cooperation with the Quad, and together with a deep crisis in Russia-US relations without real prospects for improvement, I think it leads to really kind of more negative developments. There will be increased pressure on Russia and Russia's relations with India, Vietnam, and Japan, and it will be more difficult for Russia to maintain a balanced Asia policy. Also, there is a rising threat of security dilemmas in Russia-US relations in Asia, and especially there could be even more enhanced security cooperation between Russia, China, and Eurasia, and the Indo-Pacific could be two different fragmented blocks if a negative scenario takes place. However, I should say that a lot really depends on if Russia and other powers, especially India and Japan, could be able to find some forms of practical cooperation in place, especially in the economic domain, connecting the Far East and the Arctic within the Pacific. And here, I think very important steps that could be taken, having some discussions and trilateral tracks, Russia, India, Japan, and Russia, Vietnam, Japan, as all the countries have good relations among themselves. Also, economic cooperation, trilateral, India and Japan joint energy projects has a very great potential. Both countries, Russia and Japan, have interest in non-traditional security, and and also ASEAN states on ASEAN-centric platforms. This could be common regional good, and this could be something that all the states could agree to. Also, the last is maritime cooperation in the region, Asia-Pacific and the Indo-Pacific, as witnessed by joint exercises in the Arabian Sea. Thank you so much.
キレーバさん、どうもありがとうございました。大変詳細なデータを。
Thank you very much for sharing with us detailed information and analysis. Last but not the least, I'd like to call upon Sir James Brown. The reason why he speaks last is because he's looking at the relationship between Japan and Russia from Tokyo, and because he is teaching at the Temple University as a professor, and therefore about various issues that are seen between Russia and Japan. I'd like to ask you to share with us your views. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. It's a real pleasure to be joining this panel that Shimotomai Sensei set us some very challenging and interesting questions. But I'm going to try and keep it nice and simple to begin with and just focus on one of those questions, which is the prospects for Japan-Russia relations. And in looking at that question to do with the future of that relationship, I think it's useful to, first of all, look a little bit to the past. And so essentially the main point I want to make in these initial comments is learning lessons from the Abe administration's approach towards Russia. Now, I think everyone can agree that the Abe administration did not achieve the success that it wanted in relations with Russia. Prime Minister Abe made relations with Russia a real priority. And as I think as everyone knows, he really tried to push forward this relationship and take a number of steps designed to please the Putin administration, or at least to avoid antagonizing it. So when it comes to the territorial issue, this involved emphasizing just 2 islands rather than all 4, seeking to develop relations of trust with President Putin, emphasizing economic cooperation, and also shying away from some of the Western criticism of Russian foreign policy and domestic developments. So those were some of the steps that Abe took. And if we assess the results of those efforts, clearly it was not what Prime Minister Abe might have hoped for. And I think the clearest symbolization of that were the changes to the Russian constitution last year. These have been very much in the news of late within Japan because of President Putin's comments drawing attention to them, saying that cooperation with Japan cannot contradict Russia's constitution, which now includes that line outlawing moves and calls for the alienation of Russian territory. So that was obviously a disappointment for the Abe administration. There was also no real progress on joint economic activities on the disputed islands. And at the same time, Russia has proceeded with increasing its military deployments on the islands in 2016, with the Bal and Bastion anti-ship missiles being deployed there, and more recently with the S-300 deployment too. Added to that, Russian military aviation remains active in the vicinity of Japan. There's been no major decrease in that area for fiscal 2019. Japan's jets were scrambled on 268 occasions in order to intercept approaching Russian aircraft. And then also, if the Abe administration hoped that a rapprochement with Russia would lead to some distance between Russia and China, well, clearly that hasn't happened either, as symbolized by the joint air patrols undertaken by Moscow and Beijing in both July 2019 and December 2020. So overall, there's not been the achievements that the Abe government was no doubt hoping for. But I think that it's always good, if possible, to be positive. And I think that in a way you can see a silver lining in this disappointment for Abe, in that it can serve as almost a valuable test case. Within Japan, there's long been the argument that a territorial agreement would still be possible under certain circumstances. It required a prime minister who was committed to achieving it. It required certain economic incentives being offered to the Russian side, and also a willingness to compromise on the territorial issue itself. And Prime Minister Abe, in essence, sought to fulfill all of those conditions. He really did everything that might be expected of a Japanese leader in order to try and make an agreement. And the result is very, very clear. So I think that from this, a lesson can be drawn from the Japanese side, which is that essentially there has been for a long time a degree of false hope in Japan's position. And overall, Japan's policy towards Russia has been distorted by the fear that taking certain action would lead to setbacks when it comes to the territorial issue. So if we look at what comes next for Japan, I think that in learning from the Abe government's experience, there's actually a possibility for Japan's Russia policy to be freer, to be to escape from the belief that a deal is on the horizon, and actually to engage with Russia by putting the territorial issue somewhat to one side. Now, of course, this does not mean pointlessly antagonizing Russia, certainly not. Instead, there are many areas in which Japan can continue to cooperate and engage with Russia. One of the things that was highlighted as a topic for this panel is energy cooperation, perhaps in the area of hydrogen. Absolutely, this is an area for possible cooperation. Other political and economic areas of cooperation are possible too. But my main point is that this cooperation should proceed based on its intrinsic value. It shouldn't be seen from Japan's point of view as a means of currying favor with the Russian side in the hope of a territorial deal. Because if there's one thing that can be drawn from the Abe government's experience, it's that a deal, regrettably for the Japanese side, is simply not a realistic possibility in the short or medium term. And I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
James.
Thank you very much, James. I think we have covered and had all the speakers speak. And at the same time, I think all the speakers showed a difference in approach, or they have tried to express some different perspectives, some contradiction. Well, especially, I think when we think about this topic, what's most difficult is Eurasia and Indo-Pacific. Are they multi-polarization, or are they two different approaches? So I think that there are different views on this, and Dr. TRENIN talked about Entente, and Dr. KIREEVA said that China and Russia should, well, unless the U.S. policy changes and compromises will not be possible. So those were the positions taken. I talked about George Kennan earlier, and that was because there was a reason to this. And Kennan, as you know, well, came up with the concept of containment. But George Kennan, in 1950, in the United States, especially General MacArthur, when he tried to use nuclear weapons in the Korean War, he tried to prevent this from happening. And Japan became independent through this process. And so it is an issue between alliances and within alliances. So there are different nuances here. And therefore, having said that, when we say alliance, if we try to avoid using the term alliance, what's happening in Indo-Pacific under the Biden administration, with the rise of the emergence of the Biden administration, what changes are we seeing? Dr. TRENIN, I want to ask you, the New START Treaty. Well, Professor Hirose has referred to this as well. And we didn't think that an agreement could be reached this early to extend the treaty by 5 years. This was not expected. There might have been some people who thought of it as a possibility, but I think that Dr. TRENIN is most familiar with this issue. Can you elaborate on this? The extension of the New START Treaty, please.
Yes, please.
Thank you very much. It was an important and very positive step taken early on by the Biden administration. Actually, the previous administration under President Trump squandered an opportunity to extend the New START Treaty in the lifetime of the previous administration. It should have been a no-brainer. An extension of the treaty does not require a new negotiation. It does not require very elaborate legal procedures. And yet, the Trump administration, rather than going down that path, chose to talk about renegotiating the treaty or adding China to the treaty, despite China's well-known attitude toward the U.S.-Russian arms control. So the Biden administration was running against time. It assumed office on 20 January, and 5 February was the expiry day of the New START Treaty. So the administration acted very quickly and very professionally. It's an administration composed of professionals. It is an administration led by perhaps a president who is perhaps the best versed American head of state in foreign affairs for a couple of decades. And certainly since George H.W. Bush. So it is clearly a very important step, but it was also a fairly easy step to take. It does not require going to the Senate for ratifying the treaty. An extension does not mean ratification. I feared, however, that the Biden administration may find it difficult politically to take, let's say, a milder, a softer approach to Russia on extending the treaty than the approach taken by the Trump administration that sought, as I said, to attach new demands to the treaty that would have required a renegotiation or a Russian capitulation, which was never on the cards. So it's a good thing, but it was also an easy thing, a low-hanging fruit, if you like. Other things will be in the same category of strategic issues, strategic stability affairs. Other moves, other steps will be far more difficult. Now, the next logical step after the ratification, after the extension, of the New START Treaty would be a start of new negotiations on a new treaty to replace New START when the 5-year extension is over, which is 2026. I think the U.S. administration and the Russian government clearly realize that it will not be an easy negotiation. In fact, it may be the most complex arms control negotiation since the end of the Cold War, if not ever. There are so many other issues. There are strategic non-nuclear systems. There are nuclear non-strategic systems. There is cyber. There is space. There are new technologies. And all that has to be factored in to lead to an agreement that would take care of strategic stability in the 21st century. And clearly, the issue of China at some point will become relevant. Maybe not in the forthcoming negotiations, but later on. So that is going to be difficult. Another thing that will make things more complex is the likelihood of deployment by the United States of intermediate range systems in Asia and maybe in Europe. That could be a step leading to serious strategic complications. We remember, those of us who, as the chairman said, who fall into my own age group, we remember only too well the Euro missile crisis of the late 1970s and the early 1980s that led to perhaps the most dangerous moment during the entire Cold War after the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1983, when essentially I think the United States and the Soviet Union came closer to the brink of a nuclear war than their populations thought at that moment. So basically, what I would want to end on is that is a positive step. That is a step in the absolutely right direction, but the road is going to be very difficult and all the way uphill. I very much hope that something can be done in the next 4 years of the Biden administration, but this is not a prediction. This is a hope.
Thank you. Well, the same question. I'd like to ask the same question to James. And James Brown is from the UK. The British diplomacy, as a result of Brexit, is shifting towards Asia. Some see it that way. And since, the US and Britain have had a long alliance within this framework between UK and US, there could be a division of labor. So from that perspective, including Europe, how are you going to deal with Russia, especially Poland? I think this also, Poland has an impact on the Russian policy. So can you talk from a European perspective?
Okay, thank you very much. So if we bring the UK into this, as well as Europe more broadly, there are a number of different things that can be highlighted, whether that's to do with economics, politics, or security. And so perhaps I'd like to touch a little bit on each of them. So when it comes to economics, the first thing that comes to mind, especially when it comes to the UK post-Brexit, is the UK application to join the TPP, or rather the CPTPP. Now, from the UK perspective, that's enormously important. Huge hopes have been placed upon that, because it can serve as a symbolic step, with the UK defining itself as more of a global economic actor, rather than just being focused more on Europe. It's not going to be straightforward. Replacing the EU market in any way obviously cannot be done, but we'll have to see how that progresses. It could also be quite a complex process of actually joining the CPTPP. That's one kind of point on the economic side of things. When it comes to the military side of things, I think one of the most interesting things is the actions of the UK, France, and to a lesser extent Germany in sending some military assets into the Asia-Pacific. The UK, for a number of years now, has sought to, with some regularity, send ships and, on at least one occasion, aircraft to Japan in order to demonstrate that it includes this region within its strategic calculations. And France has done something similar to an extent. But I think we have to place some kind of limitations on this. The UK is not a major global military power. It has limited capabilities. It's not going to be able to continue on a very regular basis to send military assets of any substantial kind of scale into this region. So I think perhaps some limits can be placed on those expectations. Although one interesting idea that I saw raised was that the Quad might explore the idea of some limited level of cooperation with an E3 of the UK, France, and Germany. That is simply an idea. If anything came of that, however, I'm sure that the Russian side would see it would see it very negatively. And then the last point, when it comes to the political side of things and the region, and also to do with Russia, I think the thing that mainly comes to mind there is the forthcoming G7, of which the UK is the president. And many people will have seen that the UK has invited 3 additional members this year, being India, South Korea, and Australia. And from speaking with some Russian colleagues about this, I understand that from a Russian perspective, it would be seen as a matter of some concern if this were to be a permanent expansion of the G7 into a sort of D10. I don't think that's on the cards. For the time being, at least, it seems that this would just be for the 1 year. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. James talked about the European perspective and how Europe looks at Europe. And so looking at the Indo-Pacific from another angle, the Islam factor cannot be, Indonesia, Malaysia, the Islam perspective cannot be ignored. And one recent development that really astounded me was that the Soviet Union occupied Afghanistan for 10 years, but now, what sort of attitude is the U.S. taking toward Afghanistan? President Trump said he will withdraw. Well, he said he will withdraw, but the Biden administration may not necessarily follow that route, which means that the United States will be stationed in the Afghanistan for 20 years. And of course, Afghanistan does not represent the total of Asia, but my question is to Hirose-san. How would the Islam world be involved in the Asia-Pacific, and how should we view the conflicts in the area? Because Turkey, these countries are becoming regional powers, they're gaining power. And of course, you have the Nagorno-Karabakh dispute, conflict still underway. So you're well versed in this area. So if you could talk about that. Thank you. Well, most recently, the Islamic factor, I think, is a very important factor in Russian foreign policy. Now, Mr. Shimotomai talked about Afghanistan, but not only Afghanistan, but the Middle East is affected by the U.S. and Russia and Turkey because they're playing a power game in the Middle East area. And Syria, Libya are 2 key countries where Russia, Turkey, and the European countries are now in confrontation. There's been a long-winded confrontation. And the structure of the Middle East also has expanded to the former Soviet bloc, which is under Russia's influence last year. The Nagorno-Karabakh conflict was reignited after several years, and Turkey's influence has been shown very strongly. And Russia did lead the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict to a ceasefire, and Russia was a central player in the ensuing end to the conflict. But Turkey supported Azerbaijan, and all the way from Azerbaijan to there was a corridor which was constructed, and Turkey now can extend its influence all the way to the Caspian Sea through Azerbaijan. So Turkey's movements as a result of this conflict is now drawing a lot of attention. But the issue of Afghanistan for Russia is something close to a civil war, because when Afghanistan falls into confusion, that would spill over into Central Asia and then to Russia and Russia's Eurasian policy. That was their concern. So the Afghanistan issue for Russia is a very critical issue for them to maintain their sphere of influence. And in that sense, Russia is very sensitive about what happens there in Afghanistan. So recently, when we consider the issue of Afghanistan, Tajikistan, I think, is now very strongly influenced by China. And China is now joining the Tajikistan forces in defending their borders, which is a big headache for Russia. So going forward, Russia, depending on how the Islam sphere can be stabilized, will experience influences in its former Soviet region as well as the Middle East. And also, I think that what happens in the Muslim parts of Asia will have an impact on Russia's relations with the United States and China. And Russia also has a major Muslim population in its country. So how to get along with Islam, I think, is a very, very important issue for Russia, both domestically and in terms of foreign policy. Thank you very much. In the discussion, Ms. KIREEVA, if you could make some supplementary comments. You said, Ms. KIREEVA, that India-Russia cooperation may involve cooperation with Japan, and that there may be a trilateral cooperation between these three countries, India, Russia, and Japan. And as you view the current situation, there seems to be a lot of focus on military and security issues, which is a zero-sum game. But I think in the long run, global warming is a planetary issue, and also COVID-19 is another common issue for all of mankind. So how can we cooperate at the regional level? When we consider regional cooperation, I think the position of Russia is very, very interesting.
And it has been touched upon by one of the panelists. In fact, the global warming, especially in Arctic Sea, in other areas, we are seeing the increased pace of global warming. And in a way, some say that Russia will become a major agricultural country, even more than the United States. And at the same time, given the agricultural development in China, for Russia, in view of global warming, what sort of the involvement do you think Russia is going to be involved in the context of the global warming? I'd like to ask Anna and Dmitri. So first, Anna, please.
Thank you so much. This is a very interesting question. In terms of Russia, India, and Japan and possible trilateral cooperation, I guess we could think about different angles and different dimensions of this cooperation in practice. If we look at the speeches of both Prime Minister Abe and Prime Minister Modi at the Eastern Economic Forum in Vladivostok in 2019, we will see that they both of them tried to promote the vision of integrating and looking for some practical forms of cooperation between Russia and the Indo-Pacific, Russia's Far East, and the Arctic, all this broader region. And it seems that we do have a complementarity here. Even if for Russia's foreign policy, it is currently impossible to support the Indo-Pacific and all the concept in itself, it doesn't mean that practical cooperation is impossible. And I should say, if we take into account Russia-Japan exercises in the Arabian Sea last year, if we take into account that Russia has decided to establish a military base in Sudan and have a greater presence in the Indian Ocean, we could probably envision a possibility for joint cooperation combating such issues as piracy, terrorism, and especially, of course, anti-piracy issues and issues connected with security of sea line of communications in the Indian Ocean. So in terms of some formalized trilateral possible discussions, it probably is a little bit too premature to say if Russia, India, Japan could launch such a kind of format. However, in terms of track 1.5 or track 2, some discussions have already been going on between different institutions and non-governmental think tanks. However, it could probably move to track 1.5 and have a little bit more impact here. And in terms of security cooperation, I guess the countries do have a lot to share in common, and with the possibility of Russia's increased presence in the Indian Ocean, it will be the same maritime space of the Indo-Pacific that we're talking about, that all the countries are interested in preserving. This is one of the prospects, speaking about security cooperation. Russia would really not like to put all its eggs only in the China basket. So India is also a very important and valuable strategic partner. And I guess some discussions here, trilateral, would also be interesting for Russia, as Russia has been has taken concern about Indo-China dispute and how to maintain stability in the broader Eurasia and in the broader Asia here. Another very important issue, of course, could be economic cooperation. And I would highlight energy cooperation, first of all, and it directly connects to what Professor SHIMOTOMAI has mentioned about the global warming issue in the Arctic. Japan's participation in the Arctic LNG-2 could pave the way for some region-based economic projects, especially if we consider gas storage in Kamchatka and the possibility for joint energy cooperation. India has been really a growing market and is going to be a growing market in terms of LNG, and as Arctic is going to be even more accessible, there has been interest from both India, Russia, and Japan in establishing multilateral energy cooperation in this domain, especially using Russia's Arctic LNG projects and LNG produced in the Arctic in order to deliver it to the growing markets in Asia, especially in India. So here I should say we do have a lot of untapped potential, and also Vladivostok-Chennai trade route also has can be a kind of an alternative trade route to enhance Russia, India, and actually regional trade here. One of other issues that has been on the agenda, India has recently made new investment in the Far East, which has no precedence actually, except for India's participation in Sakhalin, one gas project. But apart from this, there has recently, in the last few years, there has been new investment coming. And we have just had a visit by Indian Foreign Secretary, Deputy Foreign Minister, and he mentioned that India, Russia, and Japan have been looking into possible trilateral economic projects in the Far East specifically. Apart from that, there is great potential for joint economic cooperation in India as a growing market. Russian companies have their presence there. Of course, Russia's presence is less than Japan's, but there are different areas, especially connected with IT, technologies, manufacturing, where the three countries could combine their potential. And I guess this is one of the things that could be explored. In terms of the global warming and the Arctic, Russia really hopes that the Northern Sea route would attract much more broader international participation. Up to date, mostly Russian ships have, Russian cargo ships have been using it. And in terms of international participation, it's mostly China that has been more or less somehow utilizing the Northern Sea route. However, Russia would hope for more cooperation with other partners, including Japan, South Korea, and of course, India and regionally. And in terms of global warming and more accessible shipping lanes in the Arctic, I guess this is one of the spheres where Russia would really welcome broader regional participation, especially by the Asian states. Thank you.
Now, Mr. Trenin, I'd like to ask for your comments as well. Anna has already mentioned about Arctic Sea and global warming, and she talked about exploration of the cooperation in this region in the context of global warming and Arctic Sea. Mr. Trenin, also you referred to a global warming, and this could be the factor to help improve the relationship with European countries. On the other hand, what is concerned about is the military buildup in Arctic Sea, Arctic region, given the current international relationship, especially for Nordic countries. The role of NATO, the relationship with Canada, what kind of the direction of movement you see. I think, Mr. Trenin, you are most qualified to comment on that. So if you can touch on that.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. A couple of comments on the very informative remarks by Anna KIREEVA. I think that rather than expect Russia join the Indo-Pacific concept developed either in India or Japan, I think it would make more sense for Russia to work on developing a maritime dimension to Russia's own geopolitics. I said earlier that Russia, as a major continental power, is thinking in terms of land more than in terms of sea. And that is fine, but this could be amplified so that Russian geopolitical orientation is more elaborate. And I would think of Russia developing a concept of three oceans: the Arctic, the Pacific, and the Indian Ocean, to complement its largely land-based geopolitical concept of Greater Eurasia. And if you like, we can think about Murmansk to Mumbai sea routes, or via Vladivostok, if you like, that would encapsulate this idea. Otherwise, I think any concept should have a material foundation under them. And in this case, I think Anna mentioned energy, various other economic issues, infrastructure, the Northern Sea Route as the basis for that concept. So I can very well visualize Russia at some point coming up with an idea of a three oceans concept to complement its greater Eurasia concept, and work very closely with Japan and India as the countries that lie along this Murmansk to Mumbai route. And that could be a major contribution to not only to economic development or infrastructure development in and around Eurasia, but also to stability in that part of the world. Now, with regard to global warming, I think that the Russian leadership is fully aware of the importance of global warming for Russia. Only a few years ago, Russian leaders talked a little bit skeptically with regard to global warming. My analysis suggests that by now they have understood the reality of what's happening, although there may be different explanations of why this is happening. Mr. Putin is on record saying that temperature rises twice as fast in the Russian territory than in the world on average. And that is a major, this is a major piece of information. It explains a lot of things like melting the permafrost, which covers much, if not over half of the territory of the Russian Federation. It poses a threat to infrastructure. It is behind gigantic forest fires in Siberia, the flooding that have become so much more frequent in that part of the Russian Federation. So, to cut a long story short, in the environment in which Russia and the United States, Russia and Europe are increasingly viewed by each other as adversaries, it is climate change, even more than public health care. And that is an area of intense conversations, certainly between Moscow and Brussels, and conceivably also between Moscow and Washington. It's very interesting. Something that was basically neglected even a few years ago could become the area where countries that otherwise see each other as adversaries have very useful and very practical conversations. With regard to the Arctic, there are two sides to the Arctic story. One, of course, is economic and infrastructure and transportation opportunities, also linked to global warming. And Russia is eager to explore and exploit those opportunities. On the other hand, the environment, the geopolitical and strategic environment of confrontation leads to militarization of the Arctic by all parties, Russia, NATO countries, and that is a concern. So how to deal with those two phenomena? It's interesting. You mentioned Canada, and of course, Russia's relations with Canada are strained, not because of many issues or any issues in the Arctic. In fact, Russia's legal position on the Arctic is closest to that of Canada, whereas the United States and China are very close on how they view freedom of navigation in the Arctic. Russia and Canada are on the other side. It's a very interesting comment on the situation in that part of the world. However, let's take one very specific case: Russia and Norway. The two countries have been neighbors since, I would say, the 14th century. Of course, Russia in those days, in those centuries, was represented by Novgorod, a major principality in the northwest of Russia. Except in the military sphere, Russian-Norwegian relations are excellent, really excellent, despite everything that's happening around them. There's a lot of cooperation, economic cooperation, people-to-people contact, search and rescue, you name it. The maritime dispute between the two countries was resolved a decade ago. So I think that there is a way to limit militarization of the Arctic. It's unavoidable to have more military activity in the Arctic. The Arctic, let me be very blunt here, the Arctic is the home to the most important arm of Russia's second strike deterrent. It's ballistic missile submarines that have their headquarters just north of Murmansk. And of course, from there you have Russian ships can also sail to the Atlantic and disrupt transatlantic connections between Europe and the United States. So both sides, Russia and NATO, have a lot at stake from the military angle in as far as the Arctic is concerned. But these activities can and should be limited. There must be effective confidence-building measures installed. And at the same time, there must be more active economic collaboration. It's also, and I will end on that, it's a very positive thing that despite the confrontation between Russia and the West, the Arctic Council so far has been able to meet and act productively. In May this year, Russia assumes the 2-year presidency of the Arctic Council. It includes 5 littoral Arctic states plus 3 near-Arctic countries. And we'll see. I hope that we will be able to strike the right balance between military security, which cannot be wished away, and economic and other civilian cooperation among all the countries in the area, plus other countries in the world. Anna mentioned India and Japan, and I think that this is the way to go. And the concept that I sort of outlined in my initial remarks, the 3 oceans concept, the Arctic, the Pacific, and the Indian Ocean, a concept that should be presented and promoted by Russia, and I hope it will be conceptualized and promoted. That could form the intellectual and the geopolitical foundation for more cooperation in that part of the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I was really absorbed into the discussion, but we are running out of time here. We have 2 questions from the floor. One is about the Northern Territories to Dr. KIREEVA and Dr. TRENIN, and also James, I guess. And the question is, President Putin, in the media interview on the 14th, talked about the fact that he wants to develop relations with Japan, but he cannot do anything which will run counter to the new constitution of Russia. Well, in Japan, sees that this constitutional revision which bans the partial return of territory and the rejection by Russia to return the territory is being reported. But former islanders on the February 7th held a meeting and made an appeal on the Northern Territory saying that Russia is illegally occupying the islands. This statement came up for the first time in 3 years. This change in attitude may have had something to do with President Putin's statement. So can we have Dr. TRENIN and Dr. KIREEVA, James, to talk about why Mr. Putin made that statement, that it will run counter to the Constitution, partial return. Please try to keep it short.
Well, let me be real short. I think that the process that Prime Minister Abe launched ran into an insurmountable obstacle. And that insurmountable obstacle was the confrontation between the United States and Russia. In that wider context, any handover of territory is politically impossible, has become politically impossible in Russia. It is the military factor and it is the U.S. factor, in my analysis, that essentially prevented a compromise solution for which, in my view, President Putin was initially open. Let me stop here.
I fully agree with distinguished Dmitri TRENIN. He has just said what I wanted to say as well. So if I may add very briefly one thing. Still, Russia would like to maintain dialogue and political dialogue with Japan, including on the issue. Of course, we can clearly see that in the short and medium term, any real resolution is unlikely because of Russia-US relations and Russia's domestic issues. However, what we could try to do in the meantime anyway is to build a kind of healthy relations. Also, James talked a little about it in his presentation. And this healthy relationship, they could focus more on the intrinsic value of the relationship themselves, the strategic value of Japan for Russia, globally and regionally, also the strategic value of Russia to Japan, and security cooperation could be one of the issues here, and broader regional cooperation. The second thing that we have already actually made a great progress in the last 5-6 years is economic cooperation. We have seen real diversification of economic cooperation and investment, not seen ever before in Russia-Japan relations. And it moves us to much healthier economic cooperation that has been mostly based on economic incentives and feasible economic projects. Most of them are not large scale, but they are quite feasible and interesting for both Japan and Russia. And I guess this is the area that we should expand and move to broader regional cooperation and trilateral cooperation, including India. Thank you.
As for my interpretation of the issue, I differ slightly from the two previous speakers in that I think that even if US-Russia relations improved significantly, frankly, I'm not optimistic that even that would lead to a breakthrough on the territorial issue that would actually lead to the return of any territory to Japan. On the issue of Putin's comment and what prompted them, I think that they're interesting, not least because in the past, Putin has always sought to avoid comments that would provoke a backlash from Japan. Instead, it's been much more other figures such as Medvedev, Lavrov, who have been much more direct. In some ways, Putin seems to have played a bit more of the sort of good cop in that regard. So why has he made those comments that clearly were known that they would provoke a negative response on the Japanese side? Well, I think it might have something to do with Prime Minister Suga introducing a bit of a shift in Japan's position. Abe had always emphasized the 1956 joint declaration, which only includes mention of two islands. Instead, Prime Minister Suga has emphasized other documents between the two sides, including the 1993 joint declaration, which mentions 4 islands. So I think that might possibly have prompted Putin to have made those comments recently about the constitution. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, Hirose-san, maybe you could make it 1 minute or so. Thank you very much. And the Russo-Japanese relations is not good now, but as was mentioned in discussion, I think there is potential for cooperation in the area of hydrogen. And I also touched about the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, where the Japanese government has pledged the 500 million yen emergency aid to the refugees, and Russia is welcoming this move. So regional projects for regional stability and development, I think there are many areas in which the two countries can cooperate. And by building up this relationship of cooperation, we can build a better Russo-Japanese relationship. And then we can consider even more positive improvements in mutual relations. Thank you very much. I'm sorry for my poor moderatorship. We ran out of time. I'm sure there had been more issues we could have discussed, but I'm sorry I was not able to keep time very well. But I started with Kenan, so I'd like to end with Kenan. But the long telegram, just before writing that long telegram, in February of 75 years ago, the Yalta agreement and the Far East provision was disclosed, and George Kennan, the ambassador to Moscow, was who disclosed this. And since then, the borders that Japan had abandoned had entered into long years of conversations, which has not been resolved. And there was talk about Mr. Putin's statement, but where is the border? And he said, well, Lavrov would answer that question. I will not answer, which means probably that the border issue has not been resolved, which made me feel that there's still need for dialogue with Russia. So thank you very much.